Our next speaker is Dr. Janelle Dunkelberger. She holds a bachelor's degree from Northwestern College of Orange City, Iowa, and earned a PhD in genetics from Iowa State University. This was as a USDA National Needs Fellow. She has published a number of papers and conference proceedings on animal genetics-related topics, particularly on the roles of host genetics in response to disease challenges. She continues to pursue this area of research as a leader of global health and behavioral platforms for Topigs Norsvin. Janelle currently resides in Minnesota with her husband Brent and her son Dallas. Janelle, we look forward to your presentation on breeding for enhanced sow longevity.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. And thank you, too, to the conference organizers for the opportunity.
Well,
yeah, good, okay. So thank you to the conference organizers, too, for the opportunity to speak with you on this subject today. This is a popular figure, and I hope that one of these conferences we can stop showing this. But so far, we're still moving in the wrong direction. Right? That average industry rate currently sitting at around 15%. So unfortunately, this trend continues to increase. And that frustrates me, and I imagine it frustrates you. What also frustrates me is that working for a global company, I visit a lot of other countries, and people like to make fun of Americans in general, it seems like. But this is one of those subjects that comes up in conversation where it seems like in the past couple of years, they've really kind of looked to us and thought, yeah, this is a U.S.-specific issue. Thank you very much, Dr. Rademacher. I agree with you. I'm not convinced that this is a U.S.-specific issue anymore. So I tried to gather some information to look at the sow mortality rate across the industry in different countries. And actually, that was kind of a difficult thing to do. But here's what I found. You can see this is not consistent across years, but can kind of give you an idea of where some of these other pork-producing countries are at. So apart from Denmark, we are still higher in terms of what our average level is. But the point is these averages are higher than they were in subsequent, or in previous years, rather. So that trend is moving in the wrong direction in other countries, too. So I would argue this is not a U.S.-specific issue, but we really should look at and treat this as a global challenge. There are, of course, a number of consequences of sow mortality. The impact on sow farm productivity is obvious. Right? You know better than I do that finding and retaining qualified labor is already an issue for our industry. So when a sow dies and needs to be removed, that creates extra work and inefficiencies, and we simply don't have the extra margin in our workforce in order to deal with that. Of course, also the negative impact on sow farm financials. Another thing that I want to point out is that this is inconsistent with sustainability goals. And there's probably some differences of opinion in this room on what sustainability means to you. But I think some common themes that we can agree are that animal welfare is one of those issues that pops up, as well as efficiency. And mortality is completely inconsistent with those goals, right? It's an animal welfare issue in and of itself, and it's conflicting with this goal of needing to produce more with less. So we need to produce robust sows that are going to be able to thrive in their current but also future production environments, leading to more sustainable pork production. And I'm going to be very transparent with you. As a genetics company, this is a difficult thing to breed for. And part of the reason for that is because of the way that we keep our most genetically elite animals. So we do that in nucleus farms. And one of the characteristics of a nucleus farm is that we're constantly pushing in the next generation of genetics. And we have to do that in order to evaluate that next generation to make sure that we're continuing to make genetic improvement. But as a consequence, we don't give that animal the opportunity to express their phenotype for longevity. Right? We remove her before she's given that opportunity. Another characteristic is we do everything that we can to create a pristine environment for these animals. Right, so they're very high health status. We give them the best diets. They have the best management practices. But as a result, they're not faced with challenges. So we don't have an opportunity to really assess their robustness. And we can't improve what we don't measure. So here's an example of a nucleus farm in Norway, where we collect tissue for genotyping from every individual, but we don't have the opportunity to collect those robustness data. We have a partner farm, for example, here in the US, where we have a lot of opportunity to collect robustness data. So by collecting tissue for genotyping, we can actually link these two herds based on the genetic relationships between the animals at these locations. This actually allows us to calculate breeding values, or the genetic merit for robustness traits in both of these populations. So this is a workaround that we use in that situation. So for example, some of the robustness traits that we calculate include longevity to parity 2 and longevity to parity 5. So we collect that data at the commercial level, we link that using genomics, and that allows us to estimate these breeding values across populations. You can see that both of these longevity traits are heritable. Lowly heritable, but heritable nonetheless. So we can make genetic improvement in longevity through the breeding program. And here's evidence of that. All right, so I'm showing you a 5-year genetic trend for sow longevity, where we have emphasized selection for longevity to parity 5. And you can see that by doing that, we can move that trend in the right direction. You've probably seen this figure before too, maybe not in pink. I tried to recreate it to match the presentation. But you probably recognize this from Jason Ross's report from the Pelvic Organ Prolapse Project. And here he shows the top reasons for sow mortality across the US industry. I think it's fascinating how consistent these results appear to be, regardless of which system you look to. Where the top 3 reasons, time and again, are unknown or other, lame, injured, or downer, and vaginal uterine prolapse. In some cases, I've seen the order switch, but this seems to be a consistent result. And over 80% of mortalities are due to one of these things. So what I want to do is try to convince you that we can address all of these top 3 reasons using genetic approaches. That first one's hard because we don't actually know what it is. So I think that the best way that we can address it is by simply breeding for enhanced longevity, as I just described. But now I'll talk about some ways that we can approach this second category, which is lame, injured, or downer, feet and leg issues, different types of structural traits. We actually collect phenotypes on 32 different structural traits. And here I'm just showing a list of, I think, 10 or 11 of some examples of those. And you can see that there's of course a lot of different ways that we can characterize this. But the point is that these traits tend to range from somewhere between being lowly and moderately heritable, indicating that we can improve these things through genetic selection. One that I want to focus on is osteochondrosis, because this is one of the main causes of leg weakness. This seems to impact the animal more at a younger age, when that bone cartilage is still working on developing. And things can go wrong during that process, and ultimately resulting in lameness due to extreme pain. We score for osteochondrosis, which actually began in 1990, but kind of the hard way, where animals were evaluated post-mortem by actually having to dissect and look into this tissue, and then use a visual scoring method at 8 different locations. We've since improved that method by using CT images. So every year, every boar in our off-test stations in Norway and in Canada go through the CT scanner. And they get all kinds of images per individual. And then scores are actually assigned using those CT images. So it's still a visual scoring method, but using these images to create an overall summary score. So this overall OCD score based on scoring at 8 different locations. and that trait is very moderately heritable. I think it's important here to also point out the relationship that exists between osteochondrosis and growth. So probably you can already suspect that there is some kind of antagonistic relationship here. And so what I'm showing is actually the genetic correlation between two different traits, days and phase in OCD. So these genetic correlations are shown in pink. And here you really have to look at both the sign and the magnitude of this estimate. So this negative sign here indicates that there's an opposite relationship between these two traits. So the fewer the days in phase, the greater the susceptibility to osteochondrosis. And you can see that the magnitude of that relationship decreases as that animal gets closer to market weight. So the conclusion from this is there is an antagonistic relationship between growth and osteochondrosis, where that fast early life growth is most associated with increased risk of developing osteochondrosis. So that also means that unless we explicitly select against osteochondrosis, it will go in the wrong direction. We're all breeding for increased growth rate, right? So here's an example of how we have implemented a selection for decreased osteochondrosis in our breeding goal, and it is possible to decrease susceptibility to osteochondrosis when you are adding that as another trait to the index. And probably also, as you would expect, there is a favorable relationship between osteochondrosis and longevity. And so the lower the osteochondrosis score, the greater the longevity to parity 2 and parity 5. So that's looking at more of the theoretical aspects. And next I want to show you how we can actually use breeding values for osteochondrosis and longevity to look at removal due to feet and leg issues in the field. So how is this working in practice? Here I looked at analyzing removal due to feet and leg issues as a binary trait. So 1, that animal was removed due to a feet or a leg problem, or 0, it was removed due to something else. Had almost 6,500 records that were available for this analysis over an 8-year time frame, and these data were collected from a single commercial multiplication farm in the US. Since all of those animals are fully pedigreed and genotyped, it allowed us to look up the breeding values for the sire of each of these females. And what I'm showing here is the average sire breeding value for osteochondrosis versus a removal reason for his daughters. So here are sows that are removed in the second parity, the third parity, or the fourth parity. And what you can see is that regardless of the parity that you look at, those sows that were removed due to a leg problem, their sires consistently had a worse breeding value for osteochondrosis. Looking at it a slightly different way, here I'm showing the correlation between the sire breeding value and the offspring performance, where the offspring performance here is shown as the percent of daughters that are removed due to a leg problem. So again, you have to look to both the sign and the magnitude of the effect here. So we see that a higher or a worse breeding value for osteochondrosis was associated with a higher rate of removal due to a leg issue. Also, a better breeding value for longevity was associated with a lower rate of removal due to a leg issue, whether you look at longevity to parity 2 or longevity to parity 5. So all of those trends are moving in the expected direction. So to summarize, osteochondrosis, which is a main cause of leg weakness, is a moderately heritable trait. So we can influence that through genetic selection. There is this naturally antagonistic relationship with growth rate. So unless we take care of actively selecting against osteochondrosis, it'll move in the wrong direction. We need to keep that in mind. I also showed some results here of how breeding values for osteochondrosis and longevity are predictive of removal rate in the field, right, in US systems. So genetic selection can and should be used to address these structural issues impacting sow mortality rates. So next, I want to focus on the third issue here, vaginal and uterine prolapse. There have been a number of different suspected causes of uterine prolapse that have been debated over the past few years. You've seen this list, and I'm sure there's more to add here. But when this was initially discussed, genetic background was among one of those issues. And so that's something that we wanted to dig into as well. To do this initial analysis, we used data collected on purebred topics nurse-fed females from a commercial multiplication facility in the US and analyzed removal due to pelvic organ prolapse, defined as either vaginal or uterine prolapse, or removal due to something else. We had a lot of data available for this analysis on over 16,000 sows, and we used 3 generations of pedigree data in order to do this genetic analysis and analyzed removal due to POP as a binary trait. When we did that, we see that the heritability of susceptibility to pelvic organ prolapse was 22%. So in practical terms, that means that 22% of the total phenotypic variation impacting susceptibility to uterine prolapse is due to genetic factors. It's heritable. So as a result of that, we made a decision to implement direct selection against POP. That decision was made in 2021 and added to the selection index at that time. But a next question that we had was, well, would the heritability estimate for POP change if we actually use genomic rather than pedigree data for these analyses? So to do that, we have some friends here from Iowa State that we had a collaboration with to look into this. Vishesh Bhatia, who is a PhD candidate studying with Jack Deckers. He's in the audience here today, so you can ask him all of your difficult follow-up questions. Jack Deckers and also Jason Ross. So Vishesh was an intern with us last summer and spent some time in the Netherlands looking at these data. And he was also partially sponsored by the Pig Survivability Project grant. Vishesh actually used the same data set that I just described to run these analyses, except that now he utilized the genomic information that was available for these animals. So as a reminder, that initial estimate that we obtained was a heritability estimate of 22%. And then when Vishesh added the genomic data to the analysis, he estimated heritability at 35%. So the conclusion here is that POP appeared to be even more heritable than what we had previously realized. So that was interesting and got us to thinking about whether we could actually dig into that a bit more to try and understand if there's any major genes that are really associated with increased susceptibility to POP. Vishesh had a look at that as well. To do that, he ran a genome-wide association study, which looks at the statistical association of different regions in the genome on the trait of interest. So everything that you see here above that pink dashed line was statistically significantly associated with susceptibility to POP. Those 6 regions are listed here, as well as the percent of genetic variance that each of those individual regions explains. Altogether, when you look at the sum of those regions, is around 9%, meaning that 9% of the total genetic component was due to these regions. That's pretty small when we look to the contributions of the genetic effect across the genome, leading us to conclude that the genetic basis of POP is mainly due to genes, many genes with small effects. So we'd call that a polygenic or a complex trait. He did, however, follow up by looking into some of these different regions to try and get an understanding of what types of genes are harbored within those regions, and found some interesting candidate genes. So in all of these cases, the biological role of these genes does support an association with pelvic organ prolapse. So you can see things like pelvic organ support, smooth muscle tissue, calcium level, and even susceptibility to uterine prolapse in other species. And if you want more details about this, Vishesh worked very hard to make a very nice publication, which is available in Frontiers in Genetics, that has all the information on these analyses. So to summarize, results from this study confirm there's a genetic basis for susceptibility to POP. Initial results estimated heritability at 22% based on pedigree information. But when we added genomic information, we saw that actually increased to 35%. So this is a moderately heritable trait. Results of looking at the genome-wide association study revealed that this has a complex genetic basis, meaning that this is really caused by many genes that have small effects on the trait of interest. That also means that we can't just pick on a single gene to make selection decisions. That's not going to work. We have to take the combined effect of all of these regions when making selection. So that's what we've done by developing breeding values for POP. And as you can see, that is working by moving in the right direction. So that covers the top 3 reasons for sow mortality within the industry. And I just want to close here by talking about one additional mortality reason, which is disease. And the reason that I want to focus on this reason as well is because of the relevance that this has for sustainability. So even in the introduction, Dr. Greiner mentioned sustainability and the importance that that has in what we are currently doing. And so again, this can have different definitions depending on who you're talking to, but I think some common themes we tend to hear are the need to reduce our carbon footprint, reducing antibiotic usage, and raising happier and healthier animals. And disease comes in and compromises all of those things. The good news is that there is a lot of variation in how individual animals respond to disease challenge. So what I'm showing here are some results from a research study that we conducted with almost 1,500 finishing pigs, where we inoculated every single animal with highly infectious PRRS, PRRS 174, and these animals were naturally co-infected with all kinds of secondary pathogens, which is real-world PRRS. And this is looking at a distribution of clinical scores at peak clinical challenge at 13 days post-infection. And you can see there's quite a range in terms of animals that appeared to be perfectly physically healthy versus a number of animals that had already died by that time point. And what's also encouraging is that we see that there is a genetic basis to that phenotypic variation. So here I'm just showing the height of the bar here, which is representative of percent progeny losses for each of the different sires that was used to produce the progeny in this study. And I'm sure you can immediately detect that there are some sires here that you would not want to use in subsequent projects with 30 or even 40% progeny losses versus other sires that had 3, 2, and even 0% progeny losses. We see the same phenomena when you look to the maternal contribution. So again, there's a female here who lost over half of her litter, and then others that did not lose any of their progeny. And when we look to the results of genetic analyses of results from this study, we can see that growth rate and mortality are all moderately heritable traits. So again, this is something that we can influence through the breeding program. And similar to the conclusion of the pelvic organ prolapse study, there isn't a single gene here that we can target for selection purposes. This is a result of a genome-wide association study of response to challenge. And you can see that based on the scattered dots here across the figure, there's a lot of different regions involved in response to challenge. And so by using traditional breeding to estimate breeding values for these robustness traits, we can take advantage of the combined effect of all of these regions in order to facilitate genetic improvement. So what does that mean in practice? Here I'm showing a very simple example of what a selection index looks like. Right, so it's just a weighted combination of different traits in order to calculate the selection index value, which is that overall summary value that we use to make our selection decisions. So let's suppose if we put all of our selection pressure on improving robustness to disease challenge, what could we achieve in that scenario? Results from the study that I just showed indicate that we could reduce mortality under disease challenge to 0% after 8 generations of single trait selection. So if we put all of our selection pressure on reducing mortality under disease, this is what we could accomplish. Of course, that's not what we do in practice because we need to improve multiple traits simultaneously. But I just want to put this in perspective for you to show that there is a lot of naturally occurring genetic variation that we can utilize. And we put this to the test recently by doing a little proof of concept study where we actually used data from one of our research trials as a training population in order to estimate breeding values for robustness for all boars at a single stud within the US. We ranked those boars based on these breeding values, selected the bottom ranking 30 to sire what we called the low robustness group, and then the top ranking sires as sires of this high robustness group. So we had 650 pigs per group, which we placed on test. Again, we experimentally inoculated each of these animals with highly pathogenic PRRS to see what would happen between these two groups. And as we had hoped to see, the animals that we had created for the low robust group were in fact less robust. So actually twice as many of those pigs died within the first 3 weeks post PRRS challenge relative to those in the high robust group. The low robust pigs also required significantly more antibiotic treatments. So that also shows that the pigs that are more robust not only had better survival, but they didn't need as much treatment during that phase either. So to summarize, substantial naturally occurring genetic variation in robustness to disease exists. There's evidence of this in the literature. We can also show that from our internal trials. I didn't show all these results here today, but we have looked at this using different lines, modes of challenge and pathogens, and also demonstrated in a proof of concept study. So genetic improvement in robustness to disease can be facilitated using traditional breeding strategies. And this is really encouraging because we know that traditional breeding works, it's natural, and it's sustainable. So to conclude, overall sow longevity, as well as leading specific causes of sow death loss, can and should be improved via genetic selection. I showed you how longevity in and of itself is a heritable trait, as well as different structural traits, vaginal and uterine prolapse, and also response to disease. We can improve and influence all of those things through the breeding program. But genetic approaches alone are not going to solve sow mortality, right? Because even though these traits are heritable, they are still mostly influenced by environmental factors. So this search for non-genetic solutions to supplement this approach remains critical. And that makes sense, right? Because sow mortality in and of itself is a multifactorial issue. And so it stands to reason that it will require multifactorial solutions. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and also want to thank all of the different people that have worked on different aspects of this research. Thank you.
Any questions? We certainly have a few moments.
Thanks, Janelle. With regard to the osteochondrosis and the antagonistic genetic relationship with early growth, can that be mitigated by gilt development strategies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the heritability of osteochondrosis suggests that that trait is still mostly influenced by environmental factors. I myself am not aware of what some of those management practices are. I know that there are different nutritional interventions that can help, but I can't speak to what kind of specific recommendations there would be on that. Yeah, thanks.
When you were looking at robustness, is it a function of disease susceptibility, or is it a function of how the animal reacts to the challenge? Is there any indication it's, they either just aren't susceptible, or is it more they, have less inflammation or less dramatic inflammation when they respond to a disease? Is there any indication of that robustness linked to one or the other areas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think what you're asking is, could we tease apart whether the animals that are more robust are more resistant, or are they more tolerant? Yeah. Yeah, great question. At this point, we don't know the answer to that, which is why I'm quite conservative in calling it robustness or resilience to disease challenge, because in order to tease that apart, we really need the information regarding pathogen load. So for that, the type of data that we need to have is looking at pathogen level at the individual animal level. And that we have collected on some small subsets of animals, but not enough to really be able to run genetic analysis with that type of information. So thank you. Justin.
Thank you for a great presentation. You had two graphs that had EBV units. What exactly are the EBV units? Is that a standard deviation, or because those are all funky traits from the standpoint of normality?
Yeah, and I think I just put it there to kind of make it maybe easier to look at this point, but all of those traits, yeah, it depends on how they were measured or scored. So it depends on which trait we're looking at. For longevity, for instance, we're looking at retention either to parity 2. So was she still within the herd at the second parity, yes or no? And for longevity to parity 5, same thing. So was she still within the herd at the 5th parity or not?
Just a point of clarification. I think I wrote down that there's a natural antagonistic relationship between selection of OCD and growth rate. Did I understand that correctly?
There's a naturally antagonistic relationship between those two traits.
Yeah.
So if we want to reduce osteochondrosis and improve growth rate, we have to explicitly select against osteochondrosis.
Yeah. So if I was looking at a genetics company that was selecting for OCD, I don't know if they are, but if they were, wouldn't you be selecting against the best growth rate? Am I understanding that correctly?
If you were only selecting for faster growth rate, osteochondrosis should increase. If you were only selecting for decreased osteochondrosis, then by definition, the growth rate would also decrease. So you have to do both. Or you have to simultaneously select for increased growth rate and decreased osteochondrosis in order to get the desired outcome. Yeah.
With OCD, are you looking at just the genetic traits, or are you actually looking at the structure of like how big the feet are and kind of the environment they're going to be in?
Yeah, so the osteochondrosis scoring is all based on CT images, and it's actually looking at 8 different locations. So the humerus and the femur, and looking at different locations on those bones of the animal, and actually looking for, I don't know what the term is, but kind of the degradation of the bone or in those areas. And then those scores are summed in order to come up with an overall OCD score. And then that's what's actually included in the index.
Let's give Janelle another round of applause. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.